All right, welcome everyone to another deep dive. Today we're tackling a text that I know a lot of you have been asking about.
Yeah, this is pretty significant.
It is. It's Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state.
Like Theodor Herzl.
Published in 1896, so late 19th century. And I think for this deep dive, we've gotten a lot of requests to look at this text specifically through the lens of 19th century European colonialism and imperialism.
Right, exactly. So we're going to use the text itself as our jumping off point, and kind of see, like, how does this vision that Herzl lays out, how does it how does it fit into this larger picture of colonialism and imperialism that was so prevalent at the time, right?
Yeah.
So some of the big questions we want to think about are, how does Herzl's proposal reflect colonial thinking? How does it address, or maybe more accurately not address, the rights and claims of the people who are already living in the territory that he's talking about? What kinds of comparisons can we draw to other colonial projects that were happening at the same time? And then finally, what are some of the underlying assumptions about land and sovereignty that are kind of baked into this text?
Yeah. So as folks probably know, the 19th century was like the age of European colonial expansion.
Right.
And I think when we read Der Judenstaat against that backdrop, some really interesting things start to pop out. So Herzl, he's making this case for the establishment of a Jewish state as a kind of urgent necessity.
Right.
Because of anti-Semitism, right?
Yeah.
Which was so widespread in Europe at the time.
Yeah.
And he gives all these examples, from Russia, Romania, Germany, Austria. He even mentions Algeria and Paris, right? So it's this kind of like global picture that he's painting of this increasingly hostile environment for Jews.
Yeah, and it's really interesting how he sort of frames the identity of the Jewish people.
Right.
He talks about the Jews as, a people, one people, but without a territory of their own. And this idea that a nation needs to have a physical land base, to be a real nation, that was a really powerful idea in 19th century Europe, right?
Yeah.
And, it was tied up with all these nationalist movements that were happening at the time. But the problem is when you start applying that idea in a colonial context, it often ends up justifying, taking land for people who are already there.
Exactly. And so, Herzl lays out this proposal, right, for acquiring land, either in Palestine or Argentina, and then organizing this mass transfer of people to create this new state. And that whole process, right, of planning and executing the movement of an entire population to a new territory, that really echoes what we see in a lot of colonial projects, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, think about the settlement of North America, for example.
Or Australia. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's interesting too when Herzl talks about Palestine specifically. There's this one phrase where he talks about bringing culture against barbarism, and that kind of language. That's like a classic colonial trope, right? It's the idea of the civilizing mission, right? Where European powers are coming in and they're saying, well, we're bringing progress, we're bringing enlightenment to these people who need it, right?
Right.
And it kind of implies that the people who are already there, they're somehow not civilized, right? Or they're lacking something.
Yeah.
Which of course is a very problematic way of looking at things.
Absolutely. And one of the things that's really interesting in Der Judenstaat is how much attention Herzl gives to like the nitty-gritty details of how this state would actually be set up. So he talks about like building infrastructure, roads, railways, telegraphs.
Right.
He talks about setting up this Jewish company to handle the economic organization of the state. He even outlines like the basic structure of society.
Yeah, and that level of detail, I mean, that really speaks to this kind of top-down approach to nation building that we see in a lot of colonial projects, right?
Right.
Where the colonizers are coming in and they already have this blueprint for how things are going to work. They're not really interested in what the existing society looks like. They're just going to impose their own system. Yeah.
And then there's this really interesting part where Herzl says that there needs to be this tabula rasa, like a blank slate,
right,
of old ideas in order to fully embrace the concept of a Jewish state.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of echoes this colonial tendency to kind of dismiss or even actively destroy the existing social and political systems in the places that they colonized.
Yeah, absolutely, and to replace them with what they saw as a better system.
Right, as their own system, of course. And then he even talks about like setting up this Jewish chartered land company, Which, that's a direct parallel to the kinds of companies that European powers used to acquire and manage huge amounts of land in their colonies.
Right. Like the East India Company, for example.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, we've been talking about these colonial parallels, but one of the really striking things about Der Judenstaat is how little attention it pays to the people who are already living in Palestine.
Yeah, that's a huge issue, right?
Yeah. So, Herzl talks about negotiating with the Landeshoheiten, the existing authorities like the Ottoman Empire, right? And offering them the economic benefits, like assuming their debts or building infrastructure.
Right, right.
But the focus is really on getting the consent of these ruling powers.
Yeah.
There's very little discussion, if any, about the people who are actually living on the land.
And that's very typical of how colonial powers operated, right?
Yeah.
They would make deals with the existing authorities. And often those authorities were more than happy to sell out their own people.
Right.
But the people who were actually living on the land, their voices were rarely heard.
Yeah. And, it's interesting. Herzl even talks about potential resistance. But he frames it as coming from governments who are reacting to this perceived infiltration.
Right.
Right. Because of pressure from the already threatened population.
You're right.
So he's kind of acknowledging that the people who are already there might not be too happy about this.
Right.
But his main concern is still with the anxieties of the incoming settlers, rather than with the potential displacement of the people who are already there.
Yeah, and that's really telling, right?
Yeah.
Because it shows where his priorities lie.
Exactly.
He's not really thinking about the rights of the Palestinians. He's thinking about the needs of the Jewish people.
Right. And this concept of Landdom, which basically means like land seizure or taking, that really comes through in the methods that Herzl proposes for acquiring land. So he talks about auctioning off land for Leistungen, for services rendered within the new Jewish land.
Yeah.
But again, there's no mention of the current inhabitants. It's as if the land is just empty, waiting to be claimed.
Right. And it's almost like he's saying that the value of the land is only created by the work that the Jewish settlers are going to do.
Right.
It's not valuable because the Palestinians are already living there and using it. It's only valuable once the Jewish settlers come in and start developing it.
Exactly. And one of the most striking things about the text is how silent it is about the existing Palestinian society.
Right.
So it's like there's no discussion of their political structures, their social structures, their culture. There's no real acknowledgement that they even exist as a people with their own history and their own way of life.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to make, right? Because it shows how deeply ingrained this colonial mindset was.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That the colonizers often just didn't see the indigenous people as fully human.
Right.
They were just obstacles to be overcome.
Yeah, exactly. And it's easy to look back now and kind of judge Herzl for this blindness.
Right.
But it's important to remember that he was writing this in a very specific historical context.
Yeah.
And these kinds of colonial attitudes were very pervasive at the time.
Absolutely. I mean, this was the era of European empires, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you had the British Empire, the French Empire, the German Empire, and they were all competing with each other to carve up the world.
Yeah, exactly. And so Herzl's vision of a Jewish state, it has to be understood within that framework.
Right.
He was trying to create a space for the Jewish people in a world that was dominated by these colonial powers.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because Herzl himself was critical of some of the earlier attempts at Jewish colonization in Palestine. He thought that they were too focused on this idea of gradual infiltration.
Right.
And he argued that wouldn't work. He said that what was needed was a much more forceful approach.
Right. He wanted secured sovereignty from the beginning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He wanted a clear break with the existing order.
Right. And that kind of thinking, it really aligns with the goals of a lot of colonial projects.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Which was to establish a firm and lasting control over new territories.
Yeah, and to impose their own systems of governance and social organization.
Oh, yeah.
They weren't really interested in sharing power or coexisting with the indigenous people.
Yeah. So, we've been talking about all these colonial parallels, but I think it's important to kind of step back for a second and think about, like, what are the underlying assumptions about land and sovereignty that are at work here?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
So, like, Herzl clearly sees sovereignty as something that's granted by existing powers.
Right.
Like he says, if His Majesty the Sultan gives us Palestine. So it's not something that the Jewish people can just claim for themselves.
Right.
They have to get permission from the people who are already in charge.
Yeah, and that's a very European way of looking at things.
Right.
Right. I mean, European powers were used to just carving up the world among themselves.
Exactly. And the way that Herzl talks about the economic incentives that he's willing to offer to the Ottoman Empire or to Argentina, it kind of suggests this transactional view of land ownership.
Right.
Right. Like land is just a commodity that can be bought and sold.
Yeah. It's not something that's sacred or inherently tied to a particular people.
Exactly. And then there's this whole concept of the Society of Jews as this state-forming power that's seeking recognition under international law. And that really reflects the dominant European legal framework for how new states were created.
Right, yeah.
Right, which was basically, you had to get the approval of the existing powers.
Right.
And then they would recognize you as a legitimate state.
Yeah, and that system was often used to legitimize colonial projects.
Exactly. And then there's this really interesting detail about the exterritorialization of Christian holy sites in Palestine.
Mm.
So even though Herzl is envisioning a Jewish state, he's still acknowledging the importance of these sites to European powers.
Right.
And he's basically saying, okay, well, we'll give you special status for these sites. You can still control them.
Yeah, and that just shows how much power European countries still had in the region.
Right.
Right. Even though they weren't directly ruling Palestine, they still had a lot of influence.
Yeah, exactly. And then, another underlying assumption is that the Jewish people, through this society of Jews, they have the right and the capacity to organize and govern a new territory.
Right, yeah.
And that's drawing on European models of statehood. Right. And it kind of reflects this belief that European forms of government are universal.
Right.
Right, that they can be applied anywhere in the world.
Yeah, and it also kind of suggests that European culture and civilization is superior to other cultures.
Right, exactly. And then finally, Herzl says that the society will take what is given to it and for which the public opinion of the Jewish people declares itself. So even though he's talking about creating this independent Jewish state, he's still acknowledging that there are going to be limits on what they can do.
Right, yeah.
Right, that they're still going to be operating within a system that's largely controlled by European powers.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, they needed the approval of the great powers to make this happen.
Right, exactly.
So they couldn't just do whatever they wanted.
Right. So I think, to kind of bring it all together, our deep dive into Der Judenstaat has revealed some really striking parallels with 19th century European colonial thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the way that Herzl talks about land acquisition, population transfer, the establishment of a new state, it all fits very neatly into the patterns of European colonialism.
Right. And I think the most troubling aspect of the text is the way that it just completely ignores the rights and the claims of the Palestinians who are already living in Palestine.
Yeah, I mean, their voices are just completely absent from the conversation.
Right. And we can draw these comparisons with other settler-colonial projects of the era.
Right.
Right, like the settlement of North America,
yeah.
Australia, South Africa, and all of these projects were based on this fundamental assumption that European powers had the right to claim and control land that wasn't theirs.
Yeah. And to displace or even exterminate the indigenous people who were already living there.
Right. And so, Der Judenstaat is this really fascinating text, but it's also a very problematic one.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think it's important to engage with it critically, right? To understand the historical context in which it was written.
Right.
And to think about the legacies of colonialism that are still with us today.
Yeah, I mean, this is not just ancient history. This
Right.
is stuff that's still relevant today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So a final thought for all of you out there. How does understanding these historical frameworks, right, these ideas about colonialism and imperialism, how does that inform our understanding of contemporary issues around land rights, sovereignty, and indigenous peoples? It's a question worth thinking about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.